Welcome back everyone to Chapter 3 where we're continuing our discussion on bioenergetics. In this particular video we're going to discuss what is glucose, fuel sources used for ATP production, high energy phosphates, and electron transporters. The purpose of this video with covering these key areas is to get you prepared to understand some of the key concepts for the energy pathways used to create ATP. So let's get into it. So what is glucose? Glucose is a simple sugar with molecular formula of C6H12O6. In chemistry terms, glucose is what we call a hexose. So because it contains 6 carbons. Now when we look at this in a pictorial format, these carbons plus one of the oxygens create what's called a pyranose ring. And this ring looks similar to this, which is what I have drawn right here. And within this ring, it contains hydrogen and hydroxyl side groups. And finally, the pyranose ring contains what we call a hydroxyl group attached to it. And so what we have here is the base unit or the base structure of glucose. Now the reason we talk about glucose up front is because it's the base fuel source for energy production in the human body, if not all of biology. And so where can we find glucose? Well, that gets us into our different types of fuel sources. And within the human body, we utilize 3 different fuel sources. The first fuel source is carbohydrates. You'll see this from time to time being abbreviated as CHO. The second being fats. And the third being proteins. And also I would tend to shorten this to be PRO. So let's start off with the first one and answer, what is carbohydrates? And by definition, carbohydrates are sugars and starches that the body breaks down into glucose to be converted into ATP for energy utilization. And so when we start talking about sugars, we have 3 different types. First is what we call a monosaccharide. Second being a disaccharide. And the third being what we call a polysaccharide. Now, the difference between the 3 of these different types of sugars all deals with the nomenclature. The first one, we hear a monosaccharide. Mono means 1. And so all a monosaccharide is 1 glucose unit. So if we go back to our C6H12O6 equation, 1 glucose is a monosaccharide. A disaccharide, the Di stands for 2. And so what this means is you have 2 glucose units combined together. And finally, we have polysaccharide, which means you have 3 or more glucose units attached together in a chain. That's the difference between all of these when we talk about the different types of sugars. So next, let's define starches. And so what is a starch? Starch is essentially a polysaccharide chain. And it looks a little bit like this. Now, as we look at this photo of a basic starch, if you isolate it, each one of these subunits is a glucose molecule. And each one of these glucose molecules are bonded together with glycosidic bonds. And so what happens if we cleave one of these glycosidic bonds, you release one of these glucose molecules to be able to be free to enter the energy pathways to create ATP. And what makes starch is such a powerful carbohydrate fuel is these polysaccharide chains can be up to thousands of units long. Now moving on to our second type of fuel source is called fats. And these are a great fuel source because they contain more glucose molecules than carbohydrates. And so we have a couple of different classifications of fats. The first being what we call fatty acids. And fatty acids are the base building block of fats. Second is one that we've all heard before, which are triglycerides. Third, phospholipids. And finally, steroids. And since phospholipids and steroids are not an energy source, we're not going to discuss them in this lecture. For right now, we're going to focus on fatty acids and triglycerides. So if we look at a fatty acid, it contains a carboxyl group with an aliphatic chain. And the reason we go over fatty acid because it is the base unit of what we call triglycerides. And a triglyceride is made of a glycerol backbone, which you see right here, and 3 fatty acids. And triglycerides are the storage form of fats in the human body. In the process of breaking down triglycerides into its subcomponents of glycerol and fatty acids, which we're going to call FAs, is what we call lipolysis. Now, once a triglyceride is broken down into its fatty acid subcomponents, it still further needs to be processed to be able to create ATP. And fatty acids go through a process called beta oxidation. And from this point, it can enter into the oxidative phosphorylation pathway to create ATP. And we'll discuss that in the next video. And our third and final fuel source is what we call protein. And proteins are composed of subunits called amino acids. You'll sometimes see this referred to as AAs. And these can be converted into glucose via the process called gluconeogenesis. Furthermore, gluconeogenesis is defined as the creation of glucose from non-carbohydrate sources. And protein is one of those sources. Now, the key takeaway with protein is that it is not a primary fuel source. And the reason for this is to convert protein to glucose via gluconeogenesis is very inefficient. It actually takes more energy to do this than you gain from this whole process. So going back to our primary fuel source, which we said is carbohydrates, what happens to carbohydrates after it's broken down into glucose, but that glucose is not necessarily needed for ATP generation? Well, when glucose is not used, it is stored in a form called glycogen. And converting glucose into glycogen occurs through the process called glucogenesis. And all this process does is take glucose molecules and puts them into chains to create glycogen. And glycogen is stored in the liver. Now, when the body is low on glucose, it can convert glycogen into glucose through the process called glycogenolysis. Essentially, all that is current is those glycogen chains are broken down into their individual glucose molecules. And these individual glucose molecules can then enter the energy pathways to create ATP. Through the discussion of our different types of fuel sources, you've heard me discuss this particular molecule called ATP. And ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. And ATP is used to provide energy for all the biological processes in the human body. And so when we look at the structure of ATP, it has three main components. The first is the adenine component. The second is the ribose component. And the third, and probably the most important component, is the three phosphate groups attached to the adenine component of ATP. And so what makes ATP such a powerful energy source are these high energy bonds that bind the phosphate groups together. And when we cleave off one of these phosphate groups, it releases a large amount of energy that is utilized for the biological processes within the body. And as we discussed before in the first video, is this type of reaction is what we call a catabolic reaction. We call it this because, again, we are breaking down the ATP to release energy. And at this point, when ATP is broken down, it becomes ADP, which is short for adenosine diphosphate, because at this point, we've only got two phosphate groups left on the whole molecule. Now, this process is reversible to where ADP can have a phosphate group added to it to create ATP. And again, we will call this an anabolic reaction, because we are creating something from two substrates. Now, within the human body, there are a couple of different processes to create ATP from fuel sources and ADP. And we'll get to those in the next video. But before we get into those different biological pathways, there's another component that I want to introduce to you. There's this concept called electron transporters. What these are a series of complexes found in the mitochondria of a cell that utilize redox reactions to strip electrons from the molecules of NADH and FADH. And these two transporters of NADH and FADH are important because they help provide the energy to create ATP at the end state of oxidative phosphorylation. And we'll discuss this in more detail in the next video. So I know we've covered a lot in this video, and so let's do a quick recap. We covered four main areas. First is what was glucose and its chemical structure, which we said was C6H12O6. Second, we discussed the different types of fuel sources. And those were three types. Those were carbs, fats, and proteins. Third, we discussed the difference between glycogen versus glucose. And lastly, we did a brief introduction to electron transporters. With these four areas, we lay the foundation to be able to start our discussion on how ATP is created within the human body, and we'll begin that with the next set of videos. Take care, and I'll talk with you soon.